You all can go ahead and open back up to Ephesians chapter 4 again. Ephesians chapter 4. Very important. So we're still looking at this transformation process, and we talked about earlier this morning that it's a two-step process, and just as a Christian, this is kind of the bare bones of really what we need to be doing on a regular basis. This is what being transformed looks like. And so first, the old self must be laid away, must be done away with, and then we must put on the new self. So we talked about laying aside the old self earlier today. And so when you dedicate your life to Christ, there are obviously some things that just kind of have to go. There are things that we used to do, things we used to think, things we used to say, and we don't do, think, or say those things anymore. If you're following Christ in the way that you should be, then you don't partake in those things. That's what laying aside the old self is all about, getting rid of all of the traits that they just don't jive with what all the things that this new self is actually a part of. And so, of course, we have to be diligent, and we have to be prepared, and we have to be focused and intentional about removing those things, because bad traits don't just leave on their own. You have to actually remove those. So we've got to focus on removing them ourselves. And so now we're going to talk about putting on the new self, and that's the other part of this equation. In order to make this transformation complete, you have to do both parts. If you try to put on the new self and you haven't actually laid aside the old self, well, then you're going to have some complications. There are part of the old and the new self that do not go together. It is impossible to be both at the same time. And I think that's why a lot of people actually struggle to put on the new self, because the old self hasn't actually quite really been laid aside. But kind of by the same token, if you have actually put away the old self, but you haven't put on this new self, well, now you're still incomplete. I would say at that point, you're naked. You haven't clothed yourself with the kind of righteousness and holiness that God expects his followers to be in. Now, you are further along in your journey than you were at the beginning when you hadn't laid aside the old self, but there's still work to do. Like, I still have work to do, and you all still have work to do as well. But this aspect of putting on the new self, at least to me, I think it's much, much harder to maintain on a regular basis. Because if you think about it, most of the aspects of the old self are generally looked down on by any and everyone. Think about it. No one likes a liar. No one likes a thief. If you went out and asked 1,000 non-Christians, like, do you like liars? You're going to get a lot of no's, probably all no's. Same thing with thieves and some of the other things that are a part of the old self. Just by kind of being a halfway decent person, some of the old parts of that old self are things that you don't partake in them. Also, most of the aspects of the old self are just kind of genuinely not useful for living a productive life just as a human. Think about it. Wrath, that was part of the old self. Has being a wrathful person ever really helped anyone ever? Again, I would say the answer to that is no. Just in casual relationships, if you are someone who is prone to anger and fits of wrath, normally that relationship struggles. And so you've kind of got some practical measures that make laying aside the old self a little bit easier. Also, just as we talked about earlier, just being a more experienced Christian, as you're a more experienced Christian, some of those old behaviors honestly, they're not as enticing as they used to be. They lose their appeal. If you are actively trying to become this Christian, a better Christian, then, being a known thief, that isn't going to help in that venture. So like a lot of the baggage with the old self can kind of be done away with somewhat swiftly and somewhat easily. And then maybe there's just like a little bit left, and that's kind of where we need to focus. But the idea of replacing these bad traits with good traits over and over again, I think that's a tougher task. That's a taller order, especially to do that with any kind of consistency. But that's the goal. That is the goal of this transformation process. As we undergo it, we are in the process of removing bad traits and replacing them with good and, more importantly, godly traits. And sometimes, as far as the difficulties of putting on the new self, sometimes these traits of the new self, they don't come as naturally as we might want them to. And I think that can be a hindrance to putting on this new self. Like, obviously, I know that I'm supposed to be edifying the saints. I know that I'm supposed to be saying things to encourage others, but maybe I'm just not a people person. Well, putting on that aspect of the new self is harder. That is a harder thing to do. And so there are parts of putting on this new self that are kind of completely against your personality and the things that kind of make you who you are. But even still, it has to be done. You still have to deny self and put on this new self. In order to experience the transformation that God would have you to have, you're going to have to overcome some things in order to put on this new self. Again, I think the idea of becoming complacent can hinder us in putting on this new self, because we kind of feel like we've been doing pretty good. We've been pretty good about adding some of these different traits, and so then we kind of want to relax. But as we're going to see here today, that's not how putting on the new self works. It takes diligence, it takes focus. And so you can see that there are kind of just some natural barriers that can cause us to not put on the new self. But of course, our job is to make sure that we are attacking those barriers at every turn and making sure that we are doing the things that we need to do. And it doesn't matter if you're an old Christian, a young Christian, if you're the kind of Christian that takes notes, or if you're the kind of Christian that plays on your phone. We all have the responsibility of pleasing God and becoming transformed into the creature that He would have us to be. And that should actually be the number one goal and the number one aspect and focus of our entire lives. But again, unfortunately, sometimes this transformation, it isn't the main aspect of our lives. It's another one of the cogs in our lives. It's just another thing. So maybe we go to work, we hunt, we watch football, and we go to church, and that's who we are. And so we're not overly concerned with living the kind of Christian life that we ought to. We aren't focused on becoming a new person, a person that is favorable in the sight of God. So being a thriving Christian, it's not the thing in our lives. It's just another thing, and it's a casual thing. But experiencing this transformation, it has to be the exclusive focus in order for it to work. And so if there is anything in your life that is more important than becoming transformed, then that's going to have to change. It's going to have to change right here and right now, because this transformation is too important. So again, here in Ephesians chapter 4, this is again one of the locations of that old self, new self tactic here, and we're going to read beginning in verse 24 through the end of the chapter. And Paul writes, "And put on the new self, which is in the likeness of God, which in the likeness of God has been created in righteousness and holiness of truth. Therefore, laying aside falsehood, speak truth, each one of you, with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. Be angry and yet do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not give the devil an opportunity. He who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor, performing with his own hands what is good, so that he will have something to share with one who has need. Let no unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but only such a word as is good for edification, according to the need of the moment, so that it will give grace to those who hear. Do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you." And so there are some aspects that we read about here that I think are super important, and they kind of form the why of why we need to make sure that we are putting on this new self. And if we can remember some of these traits, then hopefully it will compel us to want to make sure we're putting on the new self. And so the first thing that I want to call your attention to is the fact that this new self is for Christians. It is put on by Christians. He says, so you and I, as Christians, we need to be monitoring this because Christians are the one who put on the new self. And I think when we talk about putting on the new self, I think it's usually in regards to a new Christian. And so when we are talking to someone who is either a new Christian or someone who we're trying to talk to about becoming a Christian, we're explaining to them what is required of them in order to live this new life. And I think that's good, and I think that's helpful because honestly, people just need to know what they're signing up for. But what I'm saying is that every single day, a Christian needs to make sure that they're putting on the new self, or at the very least, making sure that it is still on. Because think of who this charge here in Ephesians chapter 4 is written to. When he says to put on the new self, who is it that he's talking to? He's talking to Christians. He's talking to the church that meets in Ephesus. They needed to be reminded to put on the new self. So evidently, they were baptized believers who did not have this new self on, and that's why Paul has to remind them. So we can't just think that just because we're Christians that we are past this point of needing to monitor putting on this new self, because the original charge was to people who were Christians just like us. They were believers just like us, and they were susceptible to not having the new self on, again, just like us. We are in the same boat as the church in Ephesus. And God felt the need to remind the Christians there to put on the new self because just as humans, sometimes we forget. Kind of as life gets hectic, we can forget. As bills add up and we lose loved ones and as uncertainty and doubt kind of creep in, we can lose track of the different things that we're supposed to be doing. And so as life happens, it can distract us from our real calling of being transformed. And we all experience life and the different challenges and the different distractions that come with it. But since we know that means we have to make sure that we are actually reminding ourselves to put on the new self. So if you are a Christian, you need to be making sure that you put on the new self because quite simply, the new self is for Christians. The second thing is that this new self is actually continuous. Again, it's not an individual act like maybe baptism or a specific act of repentance, although both of those are a part of this process. You don't just put on the new self once and then just forget about it. You don't just not think about it anymore. This is a constant and a routine thing for people who are followers of Christ. Just think of all of the examples that Paul gives of what this new self looks like. Look at verse 25 for example. He says to speak truth to your neighbor. So who here thinks that you can speak truth to your neighbor just one time and think that you have put on the new self? Again, nobody thinks that. Verse 28, he says to labor. Labor is a continuous thing. You don't stop stealing once and then work one day and then boom, you're good. He says performing with your own hands what is good. That is a continuous action. All of these different things are continuous. So all of these examples that Paul gives, as well as all of the different traits that make up the new self, are continuous and ongoing things. So when you notice that there is an aspect of your life where you have actually done well and you are showing traits of this new self, well, then you need to keep it up because God needs us to continue to work because this is a continuous thing. We aren't talking about a one-time thing. We are looking at a completely new way of life. We're looking at something that needs to still be happening for the remainder of our lives. So even as an experienced Christian, it means that this is something that we need to be monitoring very, very often. Do we have this new self on? You can't just put the new self on autopilot. It's got to be something that you're doing consciously on a consistent basis. So this is a continuous focus for the dedicated Christian. But maybe even the most important aspect of why we need to make sure that we're putting on this new self is this new self is like God and it's like Christ. He says that this new self is created in the likeness of God there in verse 24. And so we say all the time in our prayers that we want to be more like Christ. It's in our prayers. I don't think that you could go 1 month without hearing someone pray that we become more like Christ. And that's a good thing to expect. Well, you become like Christ by putting on the new self. Look at verse 1 of chapter 5 in Ephesians. Verse 1 of chapter 5, he says, "Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children." So this new self passage there at the end of chapter 4, it is actually sandwiched between two calls to be like God. So if we say that we want to be like Him, then the responsibility is on us. If the only way to truly want to be like Christ is to put on the new self. So don't just pray that you're more like Him, actually get out and do the work of putting on the new self. That's the only way that we can truly be like God. It's to experience this transformation here. Now, hopefully those three things kind of illustrate the importance of putting on the new self and behind us making sure that we have the new self on. Because if this command was given to Christians, then that means that we as Christians need to make sure that we're paying attention to it. And if this is a continuous thing, then we need to continue to do it. And if this is the way to be like God in the way that He would have us to be, then that should be something that should grab a disciple's attention. Because only the godly and the God-like people are the people that go to heaven. So if that's where we want to be, then that means that we all have some work that we have to do. We need to make sure that we are embodying these traits really at every turn, at all times. We need to make sure that we have the traits that make up the new self. Because God is looking for people who currently have the new self on. He's not looking for someone who had the new self on 3 years ago or 30 days ago or even earlier this week. He's looking for people who have the new self on right here and right now. So just imagine if Christ were to return right now and He was looking for people who had the new self on, but you didn't have it on that day. I would say that would be tragic. That would be bad to go through this life and at the last second not do what you need to be doing. That would be like the parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew chapter 25. You would be completely unprepared. But you don't have to be unprepared. In fact, my urge is that you don't be unprepared. But the question is how? How is it? How can we make sure that we have this new self on? Thankfully, there are actually some things about ourselves that we can check to make sure that we are still on the right track, to make sure that we have this new self on. I kind of boiled it down to 3 general ways to make sure that we have the new self on. And so what we're going to need to do is make sure that we are examining ourselves and to figure out where specifically we might fall into some of these more general categories. It's one of those things it's really between you and God, and God knows where your deficiencies are, but thankfully we know where our own deficiencies are as well. So I really encourage you to take some time this week and just kind of look to see if you can tell if you actually have this new self on. Because again, I don't know exactly what you need to work on, because I just met most of you, and I'm not with you guys all the time, but I'm with myself all the time, so I know the things that I need to work on, and certainly individually we all know the different things that we might struggle with. Well, the first way to check to see if you have this new self on is to actually check your actions, because this new self is going to experience a complete change in our actions. Again, notice the kind of not this, but that language there in Ephesians chapter 4. He says, laying aside all falsehood, speak truth. So you don't lie, you're going to speak truth. He says, he who steals must steal no longer, but rather he must labor. No unwholesome word proceed from your mouth, but now you speak words of edification. So you are exchanging a bad action for a good one. And I think the beauty is that for a lot of this transformation process is that you can kind of keep the same energy, but you're going to just have to use it for good now. You're going to have to use it in a godly way now. So say you at one point you were a gossip, and that's who you were. Well, you can't do that anymore, but you can still talk about people, but just Just now you can only say good things and truthful things and edifying things. And I know that's probably a lot less fun, but that is a godly way to use the tongue. So instead of being a gossip, now you're going to encourage other people. So stealing or being a thief, that was one of the examples that Paul used. And to me, that sounds like that's a lot of hard work. And I'm open to that being just a me thing, and maybe I'm the only one who thinks that's a lot of work. But it seems like you are going to be expending a lot of energy and effort in order to be a successful thief, especially if you're the kind of thief that's trying to make your living that way. So instead of using that energy as a thief, now you're going to use it to labor. Instead of using your energy for something that was a byproduct of the old self, now you're going to use it for something that is a product of this new self. And I think you can just go on and on and on, showing the different ways that an action of the old self can actually be changed and used now for God and for this new self. But how many times do we just try to maybe hide behind the idea that maybe we just don't do bad things? And yes, not doing bad things is a huge part of it. That's half the battle. And please do not do bad things. Don't take that from this that Cody thinks you can do bad things. Do not do bad things. That's important. But if your most redeeming quality as an experienced Christian is that you don't do bad things, well then that's a problem. Because the pattern here is that you don't do this bad thing because now you're focused on doing this other good thing. And so what good things are you doing? If you were to examine yourself and to look at your own actions, what good things are you doing? Are there any good things that you're doing? Is there something that you could point to and say, this is something that I do well for the Lord? So yes, you don't curse. But do you speak kindly? Do you edify the saints with your words? Sure, you don't spend time watching R-rated movies, but do you spend time reading your Bible? Or if you have a family, do you have a dedicated Bible time? This new self has all new and godly actions. And so if you can't point to an action that you do well for the Lord, then that's not good. That means that you don't completely have this new self on. But the good thing is that you have time to change it. All of us do have one thing in common. It's that we can open up Scripture and we can see the things that God would have us to do. We can see the actions of someone who is in right standing with God, and we can do those things. And so this new self comes with new actions. And so if you want to be able to tell if you have this new self on, I think you can check your actions and see if you're in line. Number two is that this new self is also going to experience a change in attitude. So if you want to see if you have the new self on, you can check your attitudes. Look there in verses 31 and 32 of Ephesians chapter 4. He says things like bitterness, wrath, anger, and malice. All of those things have to go. And I don't think you have to think super hard in order to understand why those attitudes aren't attitudes that are conducive to a life of a good Christian. But those attitudes, the bitterness and the wrath and things like that, they are replaced with traits that are good for a good Christian life. Things like kindness and tenderheartedness. Now, obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list there in Ephesians chapter 4, but because there are many good traits that a Christian is going to have when they have this new self on. But I think we also know what most of those good traits are. We know what the characteristics of God are and the ones that we are supposed to be trying to emulate. So here are some examples of how this not this but that mentality can work for the attitudes. So maybe you may not necessarily give into your anger problems anymore, but have you replaced that with kindness? You may not be greedy anymore. Money may not be the primary focus of your life anymore, and that's a good thing. So sure, do not be greedy. But the question is, are you generous now? So money may not be the driving force of your decisions, but is using your money to benefit the Lord and benefit His people. Is that now the main focus? Because you don't just remove an attitude, you replace it with a godly one. We need to make sure that we are looking at our attitudes and make sure that we are reflecting Christ. Because there are many attitudes that do not mesh with this new self. And again, go ahead and get those out. But there are also many attitudes that are present when we have this new self on, and we need to make sure that we get those in. Those are things like being loving and being kind and being peaceable and patient, the kind of things that you read about in Galatians chapter 5 when you're looking at the fruit of the Spirit. We should be constantly searching the scriptures for the kinds of attitudes that a follower of Christ should have. And once you understand what those traits are, then we need to make sure that we have those attitudes in us day in and day out. Because that's how we're going to make sure that we have this new self on. We must check our attitudes to make sure that we are embodying this new self. But the last thing is that this new self is also going to experience a complete shift and a complete change in focus. And so if you want to know if you have this new self on, you're going to need to check your focus. Because the focus of this new self, it's not on self anymore. The focus of the new self is completely on other people. And I think this might be the hardest thing to do, at least all of the time, because so easily we can get back to being focused on self. But selfishness, that was a trait of the old self. This new self is actually selfless. Look again at some of the examples that of change that Paul is referring to. He says, speak truth to one another. But why do you speak truth to one another? It's for we are members of one another. Because of our responsibility to each other, we have to speak truth to each other. Why do we labor instead of steal? It's so that we will have something to share with the one who might have need. So working and working hard is so important because it gives you the ability to help others. Why do we speak words of edification instead of rotten words? It's so that because it will give grace to those who hear. It's all about other people and recognizing your role in serving them. And so for this new self, for this new life, it is a whole life that is dedicated to others. And so one of the major ways to tell if you have this new self on is if you feel the urge to help other people. A selfish Christian that does not put others first does not have this new self on. You see this in Romans 12, another transformation passage that we talked about. He talks about being transformed by the renewal of your mind, and then he spends the rest of the chapter talking about the different ways that you need to put other people first, because that's what being transformed looks like. Philippians chapter 2, that's another chapter that is just filled with language of others first, because that's what having this new self on is all about. One of the major barometers for judging whether or not we have this new self on is where other people land on our priority list. Now again, this one is hard to do consistently and it's hard to do practically, but if other people aren't even on your mind, if they aren't even considered when you are making your own decisions, or if you just find it hard to put others first, that means that new self isn't quite on yet. And so if you want to know if you have this new self on, then we have to check our focus. See if you are more focused on helping others or if you are more focused on self. Now again, you know kind of if you fit into one of these three different categories and maybe where exactly you fit into these different categories. You know if you struggle with selfishness and an improper focus. You know if you have attitudes that a Christian shouldn't have. You know if you do things and you have actions that you do on a regular basis that are not Christ-like. Well, let's fix them. Let's do the hard work and fix them. Let's put on the new self. Let's be diligent and be honest and really make sure that we are doing the things that are necessary in order to completely experience this transformation. Because our transformation is a lifelong journey. Your baptism into Christ was really just the beginning. It's almost like that was the sign-ups for who is going to enlist in God's army. So it's a big deal. It's an extremely big deal. But we know that the hard work starts once you actually become a soldier. Now there are going to be some things that you have to do in order to demonstrate that you're going to honor your commitment to this transformation. We can't just say that we're a Christian. We actually have to demonstrate it day in and day out. And so this new self is going to take up all areas of our lives. It's going to take up the things that we say, the things that we do, the things that we think. And since it takes up everything, that means that there's a lot of hard work that we're going to have to do. because we all have areas where we can make sure that we're doing better at having these different characteristics. Because there is no putting on a part of this new self. If we are lacking in one area, we can't use our strength in another area to just as an excuse to not focus on that other one over there. Like I can't say that I know that I'm having impure thoughts, but my speech has been really, really good here lately. I've got to get to work where I'm lacking. I've got to focus on the different areas where I might be struggling, because every single part of our lives has to be touched by this new self. And as I was studying, putting on the new self, I realized that it really is hardcore. Like it's intense, and it is huge. It's radical. It calls for life-altering changes. But I think verses 26 and 27, that's kind of the same spirit that Paul uses there. He says, "Do not let the sun go down on your anger." That's an above and beyond nature that he's kind of talking about there, because we recognize how anger can lead to sin, and we know that just letting that fester can kind of make that even easier. Well, Paul says, don't even let it come to that. Don't even go to bed angry. Again, I would say that is a radical charge. That's a radical and intense expectation. Do not let the devil have any opportunity. That's a radical expectation, and I can guarantee you that he's looking for that opportunity. He wants nothing more than to find a way to make you take off this new self, and that's why we have to be active and we have to be proactive. There is nothing passive about what is commanded here in Ephesians chapter 4. We need to get to living the kinds of lives where we are in the habit of regularly checking to make sure that we do not have any weak spots. And so if you haven't put Christ on in baptism, you can make that right today. You can get started on that journey. Please, honestly, make sure that you make that right here and right now, because now is the time to start on this transformation process. The Lord has been patient, and the Lord is long-suffering, and he's been patient and long-suffering with you. But there will be a time when it's too late. That's the funny thing about opportunities, is they're not here forever. But right now, right here, you have the opportunity to make sure that your life is right with God. So take advantage of this opportunity today. And kind of same if you have already become a Christian, but you've fallen short in some way. You have the opportunity to make sure your life is right with God and that you're in a right relationship with God as well. There's no reason not to rededicate yourself to putting on this new self and laying aside the old self right here and right now. You can get back on track today. And we would want to help you with that in any way that we can. We would love to pray for you and pray with you and do anything that we possibly can. So if you have any needs here this morning, please make it known as we stand and as we sing.